The employees at Cedar Ridge Wildlife Park would later say the same thing over and over again. They had never seen a mother gorilla willingly give her baby to a human before. The late afternoon air carried the smell of rain as families crowded around the massive gorilla enclosure on a quiet Thursday in Oregon. Children pressed sticky fingers against the thick viewing glass while parents lifted phones to capture videos of Kira, the 12-year-old western lowland gorilla that visitors had adored for years. She sat silently in the corner of the habitat with her baby, Milo, curled against her chest beneath the soft gray fur that rose and fell with every slow breath. Most people came to Cedar Ridge hoping to see loud moments, chest beating, running, playful wrestling, but Kira was different that day. She barely moved. Her dark eyes followed the crowd with an intensity that made some visitors uncomfortable without understanding why. Near the back of the viewing area stood Ethan Carter, a 34-year-old travel photographer from Seattle who had stopped at the park almost by accident during a long drive down Interstate 5. He wasn't there with children. He wasn't even planning to stay more than 20 minutes. But something about Kira kept him standing there long after the other visitors drifted away toward the food court and gift shop. Every few seconds, Kira glanced directly at him. Not at the crowd. Not at the kids tapping the glass. Only at him. Ethan shifted awkwardly and checked his watch. "That gorilla's been staring at you for 10 minutes. A woman beside him whispered nervously to her husband. Ethan forced a small laugh, but deep down, he felt it too. There was something unsettling about the way Kira watched him. It didn't feel random. It felt personal. Then suddenly, everything changed. Kira rose to her full height, nearly 6 feet tall, and began walking toward the viewing glass. Gasps rippled across the room. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. A young employee near the entrance reached for his radio. Even the other gorillas moved away as Kira approached. Milo clung tightly to her chest, while she stopped only inches from the glass. Directly in front of Ethan, the entire building went silent. Kira slowly lowered herself to the ground. Her enormous hand rested protectively on Milo's back for several long seconds. Then, in a movement so gentle it almost didn't seem real, she lifted the baby gorilla forward toward Ethan. The childlike animal stretched one tiny hand against the glass directly where Ethan stood frozen. Cameras immediately came up across the room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another visitor backed away, convinced the gorilla was becoming aggressive. But Kira never once showed anger. She simply stared into Ethan's eyes with an expression so heartbreakingly human that he felt his chest tighten. Ethan slowly raised his own hand toward the glass without thinking. The second he did, Milo pressed his tiny palm against the exact same spot. Kira closed her eyes, just for a moment, as if something inside her had finally settled. Then the emergency alarms suddenly erupted through the building. Staff members rushed toward the enclosure while visitors screamed and scattered backward, but Kira didn't react to the chaos around her. She remained perfectly still beside her baby, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. And before anyone could understand what was happening, one of the zookeepers said something that made the entire room turn cold. "She's choosing him," he whispered. The alarms continued echoing through the gorilla house long after the crowd had been rushed outside, but Kira never moved from the glass. She sat there holding Milo close against her chest, while security officers and zookeepers filled the viewing area with tense voices and nervous glances. Ethan stood frozen exactly where he had been moments earlier, his heartbeat pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Sir, I need you to step away from the enclosure immediately," one of the guards said firmly as he guided visitors toward the exit. But before Ethan could move, Kira suddenly leaned forward again. Milo reached his tiny hand toward the glass, searching for Ethan with soft chirping sounds that somehow made the entire moment feel even stranger. "Why is she only reacting to him?" another employee whispered near the control panel. Nobody had an answer. Daniel Brooks, one of the senior keepers who had worked with gorillas for almost 18 years, stared at Kira with visible confusion written across his face. He had seen protective mothers before. He had seen aggressive behavior. He had seen nervous behavior after storms and loud noises. But this was different. Kira was calm. Too calm. That frightened him more than anything. Ethan finally stepped backward as instructed, but the second he did, Kira let out a low, emotional sound that stopped everyone in the room. It was not threatening. It sounded almost desperate. Milo immediately pressed both tiny hands against the glass again, while Kira watched Ethan retreat farther away. She does not want him to leave, Daniel said quietly. The room fell silent. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the building roof while confused visitors gathered near the exits, all talking over one another. Phones buzzed nonstop as people uploaded videos to social media with captions asking impossible questions. Why did the gorilla choose that man? Was the animal trying to protect her baby? Or was something seriously wrong with her? Within less than an hour, the footage had already spread across local news pages across Oregon and Washington. Meanwhile, inside the restricted staff hallway behind the enclosure, tension was rising fast. We cannot allow this behavior to continue, one administrator argued. If she becomes unpredictable around guests, this becomes a liability issue. She was not aggressive, Daniel replied immediately. You saw her. She was focused. Intentional. Intentional does not make it safe, another employee snapped back. Ethan sat alone on a metal bench near the security office, replaying the moment over and over inside his head. He could still see Kira's eyes. That was the part he could not explain. There had been fear in them. Not anger. Not confusion. Fear. And somehow, even though it sounded ridiculous, he felt as though the gorilla had been trying to tell him something without words. A few minutes later, Dr. Melissa Grant entered the hallway carrying a tablet filled with Kira's recent behavioral reports. Melissa had spent 6 years working with primates and was known for staying calm during emergencies, but even she looked unsettled. Ethan, she asked softly. He looked up. Yes. I need to ask you something honestly, she said. Have you ever been here before today? Ethan shook his head immediately. No, never. Melissa studied his face carefully, almost searching for something hidden beneath the answer. Then I do not understand this. She whispered more to herself than to him. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from inside the enclosure control room as another keeper rushed in holding fresh camera stills from the surveillance system. You guys need to see this, he said breathlessly. He placed the photos on the table. Every image showed the exact same thing. Long before Ethan had ever walked near the glass, Kira had already been watching him from the far side of the habitat. For almost 20 straight minutes, as if she had recognized him the moment he arrived. By the next morning, the videos from Cedar Ridge Wildlife Park had spread across the entire country. News anchors replayed the footage in slow motion, while online commenters argued nonstop about what the gorilla's behavior actually meant. Some people called it beautiful. Others called it dangerous. But inside the wildlife park, nobody was celebrating. Tension hung over the staff like a storm cloud that refused to move. Ethan had barely slept after returning to the small roadside motel 20 miles away. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Kira sitting against the glass with Milo stretched toward him. There was something painfully human about the memory that made it impossible to shake. Around 7 the next morning, his phone rang unexpectedly. This is Dr. Melissa Grant from Cedar Ridge, the voice said softly. Kira is refusing to eat this morning. We were hoping you could come back. Ethan sat upright immediately. What does that have to do with me? There was a pause on the other end. Honestly, Melissa admitted quietly, we are starting to ask ourselves the same question. Less than an hour later, Ethan walked back through the employee entrance beneath a gray Oregon sky heavy with rain clouds. The zoo had not opened to the public yet, but staff members were already gathered near the gorilla enclosure speaking in hushed voices. The moment Ethan entered the viewing area, Kira stood up. Every conversation stopped instantly. Daniel glanced toward Melissa with visible disbelief. She has been sitting in that exact corner for almost 3 hours, he whispered. Ethan stepped closer to the glass cautiously. Kira approached immediately with Milo clinging against her chest. But this time, something felt different. She looked exhausted. The thick silver-gray fur around her shoulders appeared dull beneath the enclosure lights, and her movements were slower than the day before. Milo chirped softly and pressed both tiny hands against the glass the second he saw Ethan again. Ethan hesitated before raising his own hand toward the glass. Milo instantly mirrored the movement. Then Kira lowered her massive head slightly, watching the interaction with an expression that made Melissa's stomach tighten. It is almost like she's relieved when he is here, she murmured. Ethan remained near the enclosure for almost 40 minutes while the staff quietly observed from a distance. During that entire time, Kira never once looked away from him for long. But the strangest moment happened when Ethan finally turned to leave. Milo suddenly became distressed, making soft crying sounds while reaching after him. Kira immediately moved closer to the glass again and let out the same deep, emotional sound from the previous day. Ethan stopped walking. The sound echoed through the viewing room with heartbreaking sadness. Daniel slowly crossed his arms. "I have worked with gorillas for 18 years, he said carefully. "And I swear to you, she is trying to keep him close." Melissa looked down at the behavioral charts in her hands. "But why him?" Nobody answered. Because the truth was becoming harder and harder to ignore. None of this made sense. Ethan was not a former employee. He was not a trainer. He was not someone Kira should recognize. Yet somehow, the gorilla reacted to him with a level of emotional trust the staff had never witnessed before. As the morning continued, another strange pattern began to emerge. Kira allowed Milo to move farther away from her whenever Ethan stood nearby. Normally, gorilla mothers remained extremely protective during the first years of a baby's life. But now Kira gently encouraged Milo forward whenever Ethan approached the glass. It was subtle, small movements, tiny moments most visitors would never notice. But Melissa noticed, Daniel noticed, and slowly, a terrible feeling began settling over both of them. This was not random behavior. This was preparation. Late that afternoon, Melissa finally pulled Daniel aside near the medical wing. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I reviewed Kira's health scans again last night." Daniel looked at her carefully, and Melissa swallowed hard before answering. "I think she knows something is wrong with her before we are ready to admit it." The atmosphere inside Cedar Ridge Wildlife Park changed completely over the next few days. What had started as a strange viral moment was slowly turning into something nobody on the staff could explain anymore. Kira's behavior around Ethan was no longer occasional. It was constant. Every morning, she waited near the viewing glass before the park even opened. Every afternoon, she searched the crowds until she spotted him. And every single time Ethan tried to leave, Milo became visibly upset while Kira watched in tense silence. The employees had begun speaking about it in whispers, especially after Melissa's comments about Kira's health. Some workers believed the gorilla was emotionally unstable. Others worried she might suddenly become dangerous if separated from the baby. But Daniel was beginning to fear something entirely different. He feared Kira understood far more than anyone wanted to believe. Late one rainy afternoon, Ethan arrived again after receiving another call from Melissa. "She barely touched her food today," Melissa explained quietly as they walked through the employee hallway. But the second your name was mentioned, she moved toward the gate. Ethan rubbed a hand across the back of his neck uneasily. "That does not even sound possible." "I know," Melissa admitted. "That is the problem." When they entered the viewing area, Kira was already waiting. Milo sat beside her playing with a bundle of straw while Kira stared directly toward the entrance. The instant Ethan stepped into view, the massive gorilla slowly rose to her feet. A strange silence settled across the room again. Even the keepers monitoring nearby stopped talking. Ethan approached the glass carefully. Milo immediately chirped and hurried forward with surprising excitement, pressing his tiny palms against the barrier. Then something happened that made Daniel straighten instantly. Kira gently nudged Milo forward with one massive hand. Not forcefully, softly, encouraging him closer to Ethan. "Did you see that?" one young keeper whispered nervously. Daniel nodded without taking his eyes off Kira. "She is teaching him." Ethan crouched slightly near the glass while Milo copied his movements from the other side. The baby gorilla tilted his head curiously, studying Ethan with innocent fascination. Behind him, Kira remained unusually calm, watching every interaction with almost painful focus. But then Ethan made a small mistake. His phone suddenly rang loudly in his jacket pocket, causing him to flinch backward in surprise. Instantly, Milo panicked and rushed toward Kira. The entire staff froze, expecting an aggressive reaction. Instead, Kira wrapped one arm protectively around Milo while staring at Ethan with an expression so deeply emotional that Melissa felt her chest tighten. There was no anger there, only fear. Fear that he might leave again. "This is not normal maternal behavior," Melissa whispered carefully. "She should be bonding Milo more closely to herself right now, not to him." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Unless she thinks she will not always be here." The words hung heavily in the room. Nobody wanted to say them out loud. But everyone had started noticing the same small details. Kira slept more than usual. She ate less. Sometimes she paused in the middle of walking as if exhausted. The staff had blamed stress at first, then age. But Melissa no longer believed either explanation fully covered what she was seeing. That evening, after the park closed, Melissa sat alone in her office reviewing Kira's latest medical scans for the fourth time that week. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. She enlarged one section of the imaging results again and stared silently at the screen. Her stomach slowly dropped. A few seconds later, she grabbed the phone beside her desk and called Daniel immediately. "You need to come down here," she said quietly. Daniel heard something in her voice that frightened him instantly. "What is it?" Melissa swallowed hard before answering. "I think we missed something serious." 20 minutes later, both of them stood silently in front of the monitor while Kira's scans glowed beneath the dim office lights. Neither spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Daniel looked at Melissa with disbelief written across his face. "Does she know?" he asked softly. Melissa glanced toward the dark enclosure visible through the office window, where Kira slept beside Milo in the shadows. Then she answered with the words neither of them wanted to hear. "I think she has known for a while." The next morning, Cedar Ridge Wildlife Park remained closed to the public for the first time in nearly 4 years. Officially, management blamed a maintenance issue inside the primate habitat, but behind closed doors, the real reason was Kira. The videos online had already reached millions of views overnight, and reporters were beginning to gather outside the front gates hoping for answers. Inside the staff offices, however, the mood was far from excitement. Fear and uncertainty had taken over the building completely. Melissa barely looked up from the stack of medical reports spread across her desk as Daniel entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. Neither of them had slept much. "Tell me I am wrong," Daniel said quietly as he placed a cup beside her. Melissa remained silent for several seconds before finally sliding one of the scan images across the desk toward him. Daniel stared at the highlighted section in the lower portion of Kira's chest cavity. Even without medical training, he could see the problem immediately. "How long?" he asked softly. Melissa exhaled slowly. "Maybe a few weeks. Maybe less." Daniel lowered himself into the chair heavily, rubbing both hands across his face. "And she knows." Melissa looked toward the office window overlooking the dark enclosure outside. Kira sat near the back wall holding Milo close against her chest while soft morning rain rolled down the glass above them. "I think she has known longer than we have," Melissa admitted. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned again after receiving another unexpected message from the zoo staff. At this point, even he no longer understood why he kept coming back. Something inside him simply could not walk away from Kira. The second he entered the viewing area, Milo hurried forward excitedly, while Kira slowly rose behind him. But this time, Ethan immediately noticed how tired she looked. Her movements were slower than before. She paused halfway to the glass, as if gathering strength just to continue walking. Ethan felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. "What is happening to her?" he asked quietly without taking his eyes off Kira. Melissa hesitated beside him. "We are still trying to understand everything." It was not a complete lie, but it was not the full truth either. Kira reached the glass and lowered herself carefully beside Milo. The baby gorilla instantly pressed both hands against the barrier toward Ethan again. Ethan mirrored the gesture almost automatically now. Behind Milo, Kira watched silently, with heavy eyes filled with something that looked heartbreakingly close to relief. Then, for the first time, Ethan noticed another detail that made his stomach turn. Kira was no longer pulling Milo back toward her the way a protective mother normally would. Instead, she kept gently nudging him forward whenever he hesitated, encouraging him closer, teaching him trust. "She is doing it again," Daniel whispered from across the room. Melissa nodded slowly. "She wants Milo comfortable without her." The words landed heavily between them. Ethan turned toward Melissa immediately. "Without her?" Melissa realized too late what she had said. Silence filled the viewing room. For several painful seconds, only the sound of rain tapping against the enclosure roof could be heard. Finally, Ethan looked back toward Kira. She had lowered her massive head beside Milo while watching Ethan with exhausted eyes that somehow seemed older than before. "No," Ethan whispered quietly, almost to himself. "She knows." Melissa felt chills run down her arms because deep down, she believed the same thing. Animals sensed illness differently. They sensed change, weakness, endings. And now, every strange moment from the past week suddenly felt horrifyingly clear. Kira was not acting irrationally. She was preparing her baby for a future she knew she would not be part of. As evening approached, the enclosure lights dimmed automatically for nighttime mode. Most of the staff slowly left the building, but Ethan remained near the glass long after everyone else had gone quiet. Milo eventually curled against Kira's chest and fell asleep beneath her arm. But Kira herself never slept. She simply sat there in the darkness watching Ethan from the other side of the glass, as if trying desperately to memorize the face of the person she hoped would still be there after she was gone. 3 days later, the truth finally became impossible to hide. Kira's condition had worsened rapidly. She spent most of her time lying beside the back wall of the enclosure while Milo stayed curled against her chest almost constantly. The playful energy she once showed around the habitat had disappeared completely. Even visitors outside the glass could sense something was wrong now. The gorilla that once fascinated crowds with her strength and intelligence moved slowly, carefully, as though every step required effort. But despite her weakening body, one thing never changed. Every time Ethan arrived, Kira immediately became alert. Late that afternoon, heavy rain pounded against the roof of the primate building while Melissa sat with Ethan inside a small observation room overlooking the enclosure from above. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Below them, Kira gently groomed Milo while occasionally glancing toward the upper window where Ethan stood. Finally, Melissa broke the silence. "There is something you deserve to know," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her immediately. Melissa hesitated before opening an old digital archive on her tablet. A faded photograph appeared on the screen showing a much younger Kira sitting beside a smiling man in a green zoo uniform nearly 15 years earlier. His name was Thomas Carter, Melissa explained softly. Ethan stared at the picture. The resemblance hit him instantly. Same eyes, same jawline, same tired half-smile. Ethan looked back up slowly. "That is my father." Melissa nodded carefully. "He worked here before you were born. He helped raise Kira after she was rescued from an illegal wildlife shipment as an infant." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "My father never talked about this place. Most people here did not even know you existed," Melissa admitted. "Your father left years ago after your mother became sick. He passed away shortly after." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the old photograph again. Suddenly, memories he had not thought about in decades began returning in fragments. Faint memories of being a small child sitting in the passenger seat of his father's old pickup truck. The smell of hay and rain-on jackets left near the front door. Old pictures of animals packed away in boxes after his father died. Kira remembers people, Melissa continued softly, especially people she trusts. Ethan slowly looked down toward the enclosure again. Kira was watching him now, with quiet focus from below the observation window. Milo rested peacefully against her chest, while she gently stroked the baby's fur with tired fingers. And suddenly, everything made horrible sense. She had recognized something familiar in him from the very first moment. Not because of his face alone, but because of his father. The scent, the voice, the presence, some deep memory that never left her. Ethan felt tears burning behind his eyes. "She was never choosing me," he whispered. Melissa swallowed hard. "No, I think she was choosing the only person who reminded her of someone she once trusted with her life." Down below, Kira slowly stood up with visible effort and guided Milo toward the lower viewing glass again. Ethan instinctively moved downstairs without another word. The moment he entered the room, Milo hurried toward the barrier excitedly. But Kira stayed behind him this time, watching, carefully, waiting. Ethan approached the glass slowly until he stood directly in front of them again. Milo immediately pressed both hands against the glass while chirping softly. Ethan mirrored the gesture once more. Then Kira did something that made everyone in the room fall silent. Very gently, she nudged Milo forward again before placing her own hand behind the baby's back. Not pulling him close, letting him go farther, teaching him trust. Ethan looked into Kira's exhausted eyes and finally understood the truth that had been sitting in front of all of them from the beginning. She was not preparing Milo for a few days without her. She was preparing him for life after her. And somehow, heartbreakingly, she had chosen Ethan to help carry the part of her that would remain behind. After learning the truth about his father, Ethan could no longer see Kira as simply an animal behind glass. Every moment between them now carried the weight of something far deeper and far more painful than anyone inside Cedar Ridge had first imagined. For the next several days, Ethan barely left the wildlife park. Each morning, he arrived before sunrise carrying coffee for the exhausted night staff, and each night he remained until the building lights dimmed low across the empty viewing halls. Somehow, without anyone officially deciding it, he had become part of Kira's final routine. And Kira knew it. One cold evening, Melissa entered the enclosure observation room holding another set of updated medical reports. The look on her face told Daniel everything before she even spoke. Her heart function dropped again. Melissa whispered quietly. Daniel lowered his eyes. How much time? Melissa shook her head slowly. Not long. Below them, Kira rested near the glass while Milo climbed clumsily across her shoulders, completely unaware of what was happening. Every few seconds, the baby gorilla glanced toward Ethan, who sat cross-legged on the floor beside the viewing window, speaking softly through the glass. You are getting braver every day, Ethan murmured gently as Milo pressed his tiny hand against the barrier again. Kira watched the interaction silently. There was no fear left in her expression now, only exhaustion, and something else that hurt even more to see. Acceptance. Over the following days, the entire staff noticed how carefully Kira continued preparing Milo whenever Ethan was nearby. She allowed the baby to explore farther away from her. She stopped immediately, pulling him back after small noises startled him. Sometimes she simply sat watching quietly while Milo interacted with Ethan through the glass for several uninterrupted minutes. She trusts him completely now, Daniel said one afternoon as they observed from the upper deck. Melissa nodded slowly, but her eyes filled with tears. No, she whispered. She is saying goodbye. That night, heavy rain rolled across Oregon again, while thunder echoed faintly outside the primate building. Most of the staff had already gone home when Ethan received an urgent call from Melissa asking him to return immediately. By the time he arrived, the zoo parking lot was almost empty except for emergency maintenance vehicles lined near the entrance. Ethan hurried through the dark hallway toward the enclosure, his stomach tightening with every step. Inside the viewing room, Melissa and Daniel stood silently near the glass. Neither spoke when Ethan entered. They simply stepped aside. Kira lay curled near the center of the habitat beneath dim blue night lights, while Milo slept quietly against her chest. But the moment Ethan approached the glass, Kira slowly lifted her head. The effort alone seemed to drain her. Ethan crouched near the barrier immediately. Hey, he whispered softly, fighting the shaking in his voice. Milo stirred awake and crawled sleepily toward the glass, but this time Kira did not follow right away. She remained still, watching carefully from behind. Ethan pressed his hand gently against the barrier as Milo mirrored him again. Then Kira slowly reached forward herself. Her enormous hand rested against the glass directly over Ethan's. The room went completely silent. Even the rain outside seemed distant now. Ethan stared into Kira's tired eyes and suddenly felt tears sliding down his face before he even realized he was crying. Because in that moment, he understood something unbearable. Kira had not been asking him to save her. She had been trying to save Milo from being alone. Very slowly, Kira lowered her head beside the baby once more while keeping her hand pressed against the glass. Milo looked back and forth between Ethan and his mother innocently, unaware that this quiet moment was breaking every person watching it. Daniel turned away first, wiping tears from his face. Melissa covered her mouth with trembling fingers. But Ethan stayed exactly where he was beside the glass while Kira watched him with fading eyes filled not with fear anymore, but gratitude. The final night arrived quietly. There were no crowds outside the wildlife park anymore, no reporters waiting by the gates, no excited voices filling the viewing hallways. Cedar Ridge had closed the primate building to the public completely after Melissa confirmed that Kira's condition had become critical. Only a handful of employees remained inside the building that evening, moving softly through the dim corridors as if everyone already understood they were witnessing something sacred and heartbreaking at the same time. Outside, cold rain fell steadily across the empty parking lots while thunder rolled faintly through the Oregon mountains in the distance. Ethan had not gone home in almost 2 days. He sat near the enclosure glass wrapped in a gray sweatshirt, while Milo rested close beside Kira beneath the low blue lights of the habitat. The baby gorilla had become quieter recently, as though even he could feel the change happening around him. Every so often, he climbed gently onto his mother's chest searching for comfort, and Kira still stroked his fur carefully despite how weak she had become. But her movements were slower now. Fragile. Melissa stood beside Daniel near the back of the viewing room, watching silently. Her heart rate keeps dropping. Melissa whispered softly while checking the monitor in her hands. Daniel nodded without speaking. Neither of them wanted to say what both already knew. Around midnight, Kira slowly lifted her head again and looked toward Ethan. Even exhausted, she searched for him immediately. Ethan moved closer to the glass at once. "I am here," he whispered gently, his voice breaking. Milo looked toward Ethan too, then crawled uncertainly toward the barrier before pressing one tiny hand against the glass again. Ethan mirrored the gesture with trembling fingers. Kira watched the interaction silently for several long seconds. Then, with visible effort, she slowly guided Milo closer using one tired arm wrapped carefully around his back. The room became completely still. Even the staff stopped breathing for a moment. Kira lowered herself beside Milo and pressed her own massive hand softly against the glass over Ethan's once again. But this time felt different. Final. Ethan could barely see through the tears gathering in his eyes now. "You do not have to worry about him," he whispered shakily. "I promise." Kira stared at him quietly. And somehow, impossibly, it felt as though she understood every word. Milo chirped softly between them, confused but calm beneath his mother's protective arm. Then Kira did something none of the staff would ever forget for the rest of their lives. Very slowly, she moved her hand away from the glass and gently placed it on Milo's back one last time before nudging him forward toward Ethan again. Not out of fear, not out of confusion, but trust. Complete trust. Ethan broke down completely then, covering his mouth as tears streamed down his face. Daniel turned away again, unable to watch without crying himself. Melissa wiped her eyes with trembling fingers while the rain continued falling outside the darkened building. A few minutes later, Kira carefully lowered herself onto the floor beside Milo. The baby immediately curled against her chest the way he always had, unaware that this would be the last time. Ethan remained beside the glass through the entire night. He spoke softly to Milo, to Kira, to his father somewhere in his own memories. And sometime shortly before sunrise, while the first pale light of morning touched the edges of the enclosure windows, Kira looked toward Ethan one final time. Her breathing slowed gently. Milo remained asleep against her chest. Ethan pressed his hand against the glass again as tears rolled silently down his face. Kira's eyes stayed fixed on him. For one last quiet moment filled with gratitude, love, and relief so deep it shattered everyone watching. Then slowly, peacefully, her eyes closed. The room fell completely silent. Melissa lowered her head immediately. Daniel covered his face with both hands. And beside the glass, Ethan remained there crying quietly while little Milo woke up, looked toward his mother, then reached one tiny hand toward Ethan through the glass exactly the way Kira had taught him to do. 1 year later, visitors arriving at Cedar Ridge Wildlife Park still asked about Kira almost every day. Her story had traveled far beyond Oregon after employees quietly shared what happened during her final weeks, and thousands of people from across the country continued visiting the primate building hoping to see the baby gorilla she left behind. But the strange part was not that people still remembered Kira. The strange part was that Milo seemed to remember everything too. By then, Milo had grown noticeably larger and stronger. His movements were more confident now, his playful energy filling the enclosure in ways that sometimes reminded the staff painfully of his mother. Yet there were moments when he behaved so much like Kira that the employees still fell silent watching him, especially whenever Ethan arrived. Almost every morning before the wildlife park opened, Ethan walked through the employee entrance carrying the same thermos of coffee and the same faded backpack he had brought during Kira's final days. He no longer felt like a visitor there. Somewhere along the way, Cedar Ridge had quietly become part of his life. Melissa often joked that Milo watched the parking lot more carefully than the security cameras did because somehow the young gorilla always knew exactly when Ethan arrived. And every single time, the same ritual happened. The moment Ethan entered the viewing hall, Milo rushed toward the glass with excited chirping sounds echoing through the enclosure. Then he would press one hand flat against the barrier and wait. Ethan always pressed his hand back against the same spot. Every day, without fail. It still gives me chills, Daniel admitted quietly one afternoon while standing beside Melissa near the observation deck. Below them, Milo sat calmly beside the glass with Ethan during one of their usual morning visits. It is exactly what Kira used to do. Melissa smiled softly, though sadness still lingered in her eyes even after all those months. Because she taught him. The staff had noticed something else too. Whenever Milo became frightened or nervous, he instinctively searched for Ethan the same way he once searched for Kira. During loud thunderstorms, Milo often waited near the viewing glass until Ethan arrived. During stressful medical exams, he calmed almost immediately at the sound of Ethan's voice. And somehow, despite all logic, Ethan seemed to understand him too. One rainy evening, near closing time, Ethan remained alone beside the enclosure after most visitors had already left. Soft jazz music drifted faintly from the empty cafe outside, while rain rolled down the massive viewing windows exactly the way it had on the night Kira died. Milo sat quietly beside the glass watching Ethan with calm brown eyes that looked more like his mother's every day. Ethan smiled sadly and placed his hand against the barrier once again. Milo mirrored the movement instantly. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Milo slowly did something that made Ethan stop breathing for a moment. Very gently, the young gorilla leaned forward and rested his forehead